By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. So here we are, Concord, Massachusetts, right in the middle of the Old North Bridge, where the American Revolution started. And the Redcoats from England were on that side, the Minutemen were on this side, and they were just facing off to determine what this country would become. We're on our way to go see Doris Kearns Goodwin and talk about revolution.
Hello. How are you? Hey, glad to see you again. You too. Oh, so here we go.
Why are they important? What role do they play in society, and how do you know when the next one's coming?
Cuba was the major foreign policy in 1960. The revolution had taken place. You have a communist government 90 miles from the United States. So suddenly the Cold War, which is at its height then, is very close to home. It's hard now when we talk the words Cuban Missile Crisis. It seems like this moment in history, and it's gone, and it all turned out all right.
Tuesday, the second day of crisis. Reaction at last from Moscow.
So you forget, this was the point when Russia and the United States were arguing about something really important, when there were missiles put in Cuba that could reach us within minutes.
Possessing the offensive weapons to deliver in 2 minutes thermonuclear destruction.
I was in that generation in the 50s when, we would practice. Where would you go if 30 minutes from then the nuclear bomb was going to hit New York and it might hit us?
Duck and cover underneath a table or desk.
We make fun of the fact that we would go under our desks in school.
You cover.
But there was a real sense among a generation that the whole world could end. That's the famous 13 days, of course, that Robert Kennedy writes about. When they found out that the missiles were there, they had time. It wasn't known in the same way that today we'd know immediately and you'd have to make a decision right away. But during that time there was deliberation, there were feelings about what can we do where and what are our options, and he decides upon the embargo rather than the bombing or rather than attempting some other invasion.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, be turned back. A series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
I think the most important thing that JFK was able to do during the decision-making for the Cuban Missile Crisis was to have learned from the mistakes that he made in the Bay of Pigs. My husband, Richard Goodwin, was very instrumental in Cuban-American relations, in working with JFK. So at 29 years old, he is on the plane with JFK. Throughout the entire presidential campaign, JFK had to give a speech about Cuba with all the Latin American representatives, and Che Guevara was there. He saw that my husband was younger and perhaps more open than many of the other delegates.
At an historic conference of the Inter-American Foreign Ministers in Punta del Este, Uruguay, the representatives of 20 nations sit in judgment on Cuba.
Okay, Trey, now I have to show you the cigar box. So that night, he sent a box of Cuban cigars to my husband's hotel room with his Spanish note in it saying, "Since I cannot speak to an enemy, I extend my hand with these cigars."
This was a memo that came with it.
It came with the full box of cigars, obviously.
Right.
That's when he brought them back and gave them to Kennedy, and it was sad that Kennedy took so many of them away.
Delegation Estados Unidos. Como no tengo tarjeta, tengo que escribir. Como escribir a un enemigo es difícil. Me limito a tender la mano. So he's saying, I can't write. How can we build these bridges? I'll extend my hand through perhaps the best gift, a box of cigars.
To my husband, there could be no greater gift.
Right.
So it's just think about it. It stayed. This is 1961. And it was at a time when the Soviet Union was making inroads in lots of parts of the world. So there was a feeling Sputnik had already happened, that maybe the United States was falling behind what was going on in the Cold War. And Cuba was a symbol and a reality of that war, and are not perhaps doing as well with it as we should have been. The first time I went to Cuba was the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it was 2002, and I think it was a moment when there was some degree of engagement because the Russians were there, the Cubans were there, the Americans were there. We were part of a big delegation. And it really was a time when all sides could talk to each other. The embargo did make sense at the time. And then it's just one of those things that it just stayed and stayed and stayed for so long. And it became impossible to undo it until Obama finally did so many years later. And now, of course, the reversal of those normalization of relationships. I still don't see what benefit that America has gotten from this relationship, other than, the understandable feelings of people who were hurt by it and who still feel very strongly that they were not just an enemy abstractly on the other side of the world, they're right there, and our families were hurt by it. And maybe at some point, as time goes even further on, and people are not feeling the visceral sense of anger and betrayal that they felt, you change a policy by persuading people and by changing public sentiment. And sometimes that human sight of the countries being together like a baseball game can begin to change people's feelings about Cuba's not this alien place down there. Here's these people and they're playing baseball and they love that sport as we love that sport. Open engagement would make that even more possible. I think symbolism does matter. I think it just opens a door maybe when people see people from different sides getting together. The hard policy still has to be changed, and you need the Congress, and you need to have persuaded the country. History shows that engagement is probably the better course in most cases. I mean, if you can deal with the people and begin to establish human relationships, begin to take those steps that will create some sort of a comedy, how much better that has to be than having some sort of a wall between the two countries. I was so hopeful when I saw the normalization under Obama, and it's obviously received a setback right now, but I have a feeling that in the future it's inevitable. Having seen the beauty of the country and the history of the country, it's going to be 60 years in 2020. It's about time that this thing begins to change.